Welcome to The Left Field Season 2, the podcast where four friends get together to talk about their fantasy Congress League and what the Democrats are up to in Congress from a leftist perspective. We're your hosts. I'm Alexi Jenkins.
I'm Luis Pagan.
I'm Chandana Bale.
And I'm Himanshu Pandey.
And this is Season 2 of Left Field, Two Left, Two Field.
Back.
So for those listeners just joining us, we have our podcast structured around a fantasy Congress league. We do our fantasy Congress league through this really great website. It's called fantasycongress.com that it's super easy to make a league. You do a draft and then it tabulates all the points for you. So each team has 4 senators and 6 members of the House of Representatives. You can pick how long your season is. So for our first season, we did an 8-week league. This season, we're doing a 16-week league. So this will be a longer season of the podcast as well. All the senators and the representatives get points for taking certain actions. So introducing legislation, getting their legislation passed, speaking on the floor, appearing in news articles, among other things. So it's a loose metric for how productive the members of Congress are actually being, but it's a good way to keep track of those substantive actions that are occurring day in and day out on the floor. We also do updates on what Congress did substantively in the past week, and we go over representatives and whether they are progressive enough to pass our many litmus tests. That's our podcast. For this intro episode for season 2, we are going to go over who our teams are, what our strategy was from drafting based on what we learned from last season, and just some things to be looking out for. Let's get into it.
So I'm already in last place, so I figured, might as well get... My team is Marksy Marks.
Hey.
It was a spur of the moment decision because I hadn't picked a team name before. So my strategy in going into this was I wanted to pick, 1, some higher point earners. I think everyone kind of went for a little bit higher score this time if possible. And 2, I wanted to have a very diverse group. So there's an equal number of men and women, and I tried to be as diverse as I could in my picks. You'll see that in the Senate, it's a little bit tougher than in the House, but I think I did a pretty good job of that.
It's impossible to have a diverse Senate roster. There are just too many white men.
Plus, we had 9 teams this time, and I was the first on a snake draft, so I didn't get my second pick until way after. The people on my team, on my Senate, I have Bernie Sanders, first pick. You got to go for him. I've got Ed Markey as well, tag teaming it up against climate change. I have Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, which I think one of you guys might have had last time. She's definitely up there as one of the first picks. And then Tammy Duckworth of Illinois. In the House, I have Joe Neguse, I have Nydia Velasquez, I have Adriano Espaillat, Bonnie Watson-Coleman, Salud Carvajal, and Judy Chu. Fun fact, Salud was Lexi's house rep when she was back in SLO in California.
He was my house rep, and I briefly worked on his campaign for a hot second. When I was working for a political consultant. That did not last long because I got very jaded very quickly and changed career paths. But yeah, fun fact.
Well, already this team of super high scorers is already put me on the bottom, tied with Corey, the former Blue Dog champion, whose new team name is now Molly is my spirit animal. Molly is my cat, which he loves. So let's see how he does. Small change to the league that we forgot to mention before is that Chuck Schumer is no longer allowed. He was too high of a point earner. It kept skewing the league, so we decided we were going to kick him out.
Chuck Schumer was getting like double the points of every other representative, and we thought about banning just the leadership in the House and the Senate, but Nancy Pelosi is way down there. There were probably like 14 or to 20 reps who get more points than her, so we kept her in the mix.
All right, we'll go on both sides of the spectrum. Last place and now first place, which is me. But obviously temporary, we're only a weekend. My name is the same name as last time, Speaker for the Trees. I pretty much picked the exact same team that I had last time. That was more or less my strategy. Basically, Anjali picked the team last time with my approval. We only wanted to select individuals that were on the House or Senate Progressive Caucus. Not everyone on this team, unfortunately, is on that caucus. I think most people are, but essentially there's only certain individuals that we or comfortable with. In terms of my selection for individuals, having like an impeccable progressive record is critical, or as close to as impeccable as you can get. Not to say that like this is the best. Head off by Elizabeth Warren. Also have Patty Murray, Christopher Murphy, and then Mazie Hirono. For my house, I have Julia Brownlee, Parimala Jayapal, Raul Ruiz, Alma Adams, Debbie Dingle, and Ariana Presley. There are only 2 men on my team. Everyone else is a woman. There's 5 white people. So half the team is not white.
Which is really good for Congress.
Yeah.
Yeah, and 80% of my team is women, and I'm in first place. And I was basically in second place last time, so it is possible, guys.
Nice. My strategy last time was kind of just pick and choose. No real strategy to it, except for, I picked Eleanor Norton because she typically introduces the most bills in the House, but that proved to not actually translate to points within Fantasy Congress, unfortunately, as reflected by her weekly average. By pure chance last time, I had a pretty diverse team. Wasn't really selecting for it or anything. I think it was like 50-50 women. Diversity-wise, I think it was relatively diverse across the board. This time around, I wanted to use this game as an opportunity to keep tabs on people I'll say, in the most politically correct terms, wasn't a big fan of.
Very diplomatic.
On the other hand, I also wanted to, I just wanted to see the Asian representation in Congress and in the Senate and see kind of how they fare. So it's kind of selected like half people I disliked and half people I just didn't know. In the Senate for my team, which is known as Pelosi's Pawns, of course I'd pick Nancy Pelosi. A great person in the House, but we just got to know what she's up to these days. So I figured this was a good way to do that.
She's actually your worst point earner in your House team.
Yes, exactly. So she's definitely lowest scoring. So I will see exactly how much she does in Congress. I've got Nancy Pelosi in the House, Jim Clyburn, Lucy McBath, Lisa Blunt Rochester, Angie Craig, Grace Meng, and all of them are in the House. I think I just a cursory glance at all of their websites. Didn't really see a big mention of Medicare for All, which is sort of my litmus test for how left are you. Like, you have basic human empathy for your neighbor or like people around you, right? And to me, that's Medicare for All, because if you are concerned about the person you least know in the nation, it's how do you treat that person, right? If you just want them to be healthy, great. Cool. That's like a bare minimum litmus test. You have some empathy. The majority of these people on my team do not care for Medicare for All. In the Senate, I've got Tina Smith, Tim Kaine, who apparently was useless up until 6 years ago. Kirsten Sinema, she's been doing great lately. And Tammy Baldwin. Really gathered this team to keep tabs on Pelosi and Sinema. Tim Kaine, I'm expecting he just kind of does nothing. And then Angie Craig, Grace Meng, Lucy McBath. I don't know enough about them, so I'm looking forward to learning more about them.
You also ended up with a majority women team. Actually, I think you only have 2 guys on your team as well. Wow.
Yeah. By chance again. I'm not really selecting for anything, so that's not typically my strategy. I kind of just went down the list as people were picking to get, as many points as I possibly could, but also kind of stick with like, who is this person? I've got no idea. Or I hate this person. I should probably learn more about them. That was my strategy.
So my team is the big outlier in terms of representation. It's pretty atrocious. So the name of my team reflects that. It's called Running on White Male Privilege, because I think most of the people on my team are in Congress because of that. Last time I picked a strongly diverse, strongly progressive team. I think the majority of people on my team were Black, and a high percentage, if not the majority, were women. So my team was stacked. It was awesome. But the problem was they did not give me any points, which was really tragic. I was second to last time.
So you sold out.
Yeah, so I sold out. Longtime listeners of the podcast will know of my ongoing grudge against Alex Padilla for being my weakest point getter. I was not imagining it. I looked at the totals when we were picking, and he was literally the worst Democratic point getter across all of Congress, House of Representatives, and the Senate. So no one drafted Alex Padilla this time. I don't think anyone on my team got drafted. Tina Smith and Ayanna Presley were the only 2 that actually got drafted from my team. I stepped it up in terms of points this year, and I went for the highest point getters. And then I also, to make it a little bit more interesting, went for people who I think generally could not be considered famous, or at least are not famous enough for me to know about them. I'm sure if they're your rep, you do, but I was trying to find people who get less national attention because I really want to know what these seemingly backbench Democrats are up to, who were also doing a lot in Congress because everyone on my team is very high up with a weekly point average. I want to know what's up with that. I want to find out more. I think one of the biggest reasons for us doing this podcast was for it to be a learning exercise. We wanted to pay more attention to what was happening on the day-to-day federal level so we can hold our representatives accountable. And instead of just watching C-SPAN every day, we decided to do this league instead. And I've learned a ton.
I mean, I actually definitely learned a ton too. I mean, I was just doing our basic before the episode research earlier, and I saw all these things that must have slipped under the radar. I mean, I'm subscribed to The Intercept's daily newsletter. I'm subscribed to Vox's daily newsletter. And I feel like I do a pretty good job of keeping up with the news, read NPR, listen to the politics podcast. And yet all it took was like a cursory, 30 minutes of just like trying to catch up with what's gone on lately. And I saw all these things that I just hadn't picked up on. It's ridiculous how much more you learn with just like a little bit of more in-depth research.
There's so much that goes on in Congress that is a really big deal that doesn't really get the national coverage necessarily that it should be getting. Half the bills I look up that Congress passed, there's no reporting from any of the big media outlets. And then also it's so important to just dig deeper than what the outlets are reporting and kind of look a little bit more closely at the issue and use those critical thinking skills. Another thing that we want to do with this podcast is pass along the knowledge that we get from doing this little bit of extra research for all the listeners who want to stay informed. But keeping up with the news, first of all, is super, super depressing. And second of all, isn't even super effective when it comes to being legitimately informed about what's happening in Congress. So yeah, we go straight to the source and check out all of the bills that were passed in the past week. The members of my team are Catherine Cortez Masto in the Senate. She represents Nevada. Bob Menendez, who represents New Jersey. Bob Casey, Pennsylvania. And Chris Van Holland, who is Maryland, MD, Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right? Yep. Okay.
That's right.
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about Maryland. So thank you for that. My House slate are Gerald Connolly from Virginia, Mary Scanlon from Pennsylvania, Tim Ryan from Ohio, Brad Schneider from Illinois, Earl Blumenauer from Oregon, and Lauren Underwood from Illinois. It's a lot of white men. I get them all. I've already gotten them all confused. So it'll be an interesting season.
Poor Lauren Underwood.
Lauren Underwood, yeah, is my lone Black woman on my team. And then Mary Scanlon is a white woman. And Catherine Cortez Masto. So those are the three women in a sea of white men on my team. I'll be interested to learn more because I intentionally picked these people because I had no idea what their policies were or where they stood on any of the issues. So I'm excited to dive into that.
I hope we find out some good news. I mean, I never want to profile a rep and be like, oh, I can't wait to talk about how much of a piece of shit this person is. I'm always generally excited to learn about them and want to see if they're actually, good so I can continue to support them. I mean, Steve Cohen, the darling of last season. Right.
He was one of the first
darling
picks by one of our other members of our league because of how great he was in his profile.
Haven't snatched him. No, but I figured we should talk about the upcoming State of the Union address, which is going to be tonight.
As we're recording on the evening of April 28th.
So this evening, he's going to announce this plan, actually. And I think this dropped just this afternoon. So it's a $1.8 trillion package alongside the recent $2.2 trillion, which was the budget reconciliation bill. Anyway, this one, the American Families Plan, is supposed to be like, I guess, the second wing to this bird or whatever. The idea is for this to target families, whereas the other one was going to target people's jobs and help improve the situation there. This $1.8 trillion package is to incentivize universal preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds all across the nation, provide 2 years of free community college to people who want it. That's already the case in a couple of states, but this would make it the case federally. It would also make childcare more affordable for low and middle income families, and it was going to do this by capping the amount of expenditure by percentage of income for the family family. Going to create a new national program for family and medical leave, which is amazing because we're the only first world nation that doesn't already have this. It's going to expand the maximum Pell Grant quantity for colleges by about 20%. And then it also provides $800 billion worth of tax relief for families with children by extending the expanded child tax credit from 2021 to 2025. So it's an additional 4 years to the what we called UBI for babies. So $3,000 or $3,600 tax credit for families with children. It also permanently expands the ACA tax credits to lower health insurance costs. And then it's got a couple other things in there. The idea is this is going to get paid for by, one, reversing the GOP's 2017 tax cuts, and two, there's going to be measures implemented to help with IRS enforcement to ensure that wealthy people actually pay their taxes. There's a couple of things that stood out to me here. The fact that we can just rein in $2 trillion from the wealthy at any point we want just by raising taxes a little bit. This is just going back and getting rid of the tax cuts that Trump implemented. What if we actually tax these people? Can you imagine the amount of money that we could raise to help our nation? The other thing is just how ready Biden is to show that he's, trying to make a change while still not actually spending the amount of money that seems that politicians think it'll take to revitalize our economy after this COVID pandemic. So I've heard for the infrastructure bill, it should have been something like $10 trillion across 10 years to actually make a dent in our infrastructure. Ends up being $2 trillion. I see that this is probably something similar to that.
Yeah, I want to give a couple of props to the Biden administration because this bill is better and credit where credit is due. I don't want to be always shitting on the Biden administration for the sake of it. This is going to come with a couple of buts, but credit where credit is due. So before in our previous podcast, I had gotten on Biden about the fact that instead of erasing the Trump tax cut before, they only did a 7% increase in the taxes. From where Trump said it, leaving an additional super high percentage on the table. So I'm glad that they're taking that away. Do I wish that they were taxing the rich way more? Absolutely. I do think that the IRS enforcement is super crucial because the IRS goes after low income and particularly poor Americans specifically with their enforcement in a really targeted way, especially people receiving government benefits. And that can be make or break for families even eating. And then the wealthy, there's practically no enforcement. That could make a really big difference. Like you said, the family and childcare is a big deal, but it's also, I feel like everything the Biden administration does, for me, there's the specter of what is not being done and who is being left out of this. I think millennials on the whole, at least millennials without children, are largely being left out of the government aid. And we are really bearing the brunt of multiple economic crises consecutively throughout the course of our teen to adult lives. So I wish that we would be taken seriously by our government. And I also realize that I just have trust issues when it comes to the government. I think a lot of us probably do, because being in high school and having the Obama administration come in and being fully sold on this idea of hope and change and a government that represents everyone and that's going to do all these amazing transformative things. I was young and naive, and I was very, very, very sold on that idea. And then once Obama was in office, I remember he would do things, and to me, with my young teen brain, I would think, that doesn't seem like enough. That doesn't seem like what he promised. But then everybody in the media and all of our parents would always be reassuring, no, he's amazing. He's doing everything. Obama's so great. And because of that, I just completely have trust issues. I do not trust any of the politicians except for Bernie, because he's walked the walk as much as anyone can possibly walk the walk for decades. But when these bills come out, and they're trillions of dollars, and the media is touting it as the next New Deal, the next FDR, the next LBJ in terms of getting rid of poverty, I just can't take it seriously. And I can't make the emotional investment of that hope, because it's already been crushed so much before. And I'm sure I'm not alone in this. And that's just really, really damaging to the American psyche for everything to seem like a constant lie. And it probably is a constant lie.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these programs or plans being implemented to try and improve the situations for what I would say are the people that America considers desirable. So families, seems to be in particular more targeted towards, pushing these Christian ideals, just not without actually saying that. Where is the student loan relief, that was promised as a part of Biden's plan, during his campaign? Why is it that we're still the lowest on the rung and not receiving any aid? It just doesn't make sense to me when he could very easily cement millennial support for Democrats by just doing that one thing.
I would completely change my tune about Biden if he forgave student loans
Exactly.
in a heartbeat.
Even if he were to do his neo-lib plan of 10,000,
I wouldn't then, but if it was at least 50, I would.
50. All right. 50.
I mean, I would at least give him for credit for trying, right, at that point. But, it's always so interesting to me that, there's always been this talk ever since, like, the moment Obama got in office that, the national debt is like a massive crisis. And back then, I think it was like $10 trillion or something, right? It was a big deal when they added another zero, right? All of a sudden when it comes to like student debt, and I think it's like what, $2 trillion, $3 trillion to get rid of like all of student debt. $10,000 is a fraction of that. Let's just say, conservatively 1.5 trillion, right? Like even if it is 2 trillion, we're at like what, $24 trillion. If we add another 2 trillion, like what does it mean anymore, right? I think everyone's kind of like, there's this national debt clock that was supposed to like tick and eventually explode the United States and turn us into Greece. But, of course, like none of that ever happened. We were outpacing our own debt. We still pay interest on the money that we borrow, where we've never defaulted once as a country. So to me, I'm like, why don't we just borrow just like a little bit more money to clear out people that have been sort of quote unquote left behind and have to like shoulder this burden? Even the next generation still has to do it, right? College tuition prices haven't really gone down, and now they have to get their education over Zoom for the past year. So they've got a diluted education a devalued education that probably wasn't as effective as ours, being in college, and they still have to bear that.
We will dismantle oppression board by board. We will saw the foundations of big business in half, even if it takes eternity. With your support, we will send the hammer of the peoples crashing through the windows of Mr. Kraft's house of servitude.
I'm ready to riot. I don't know about you guys.
Tonight we
Pretty
riot.
inspiring shit. I gotta add that to my the Revolution Will Be live stream playlist. Just like speeches from
The legitimate
Just
playlist.
That would be
speeches by Karl
hilarious.
Marx.
yeah. No, it is a legitimate playlist. I made it for the protest last year.
No, I remember. I listened to it.
There was like there's a Revolution Will Not Be televised, right? Obviously it intros it back because you have to, but I'm like, but it will be live streamed. That's the one thing capitalism gave us.
You got to use the tools.
It is. I mean, I keep thinking about it, right? I'm like, if we didn't have our phones, like, I wonder where social progress would be. Like, without us to be able to like document everything. Yeah, if we all have the ability to do that now, right? And if we didn't have that capability, right? Like, even if we were all on like 240p cell phones from like the early mid 2000s, right? I don't think we would have this like sort of response to, police brutality, to the lack of healthcare, to basically any sort of social issue, right? It changed us for the good. So thank you, capitalism, for one thing.
I mean, a cop is going to jail for killing a black man. That's one.
Without
step in the
that
right direction.
video, Derek Chauvin sure as hell would not be going to jail.
I have mixed feelings about that trial, right? It's a great thing that it happened finally, right? But I don't want that to sort of placate everyone and be like, oh, we did it, guys. We did it, Reddit. It's over. Let's not worry about this anymore because it doesn't happen.
They killed another Latino today in Alameda County. Fucking cop kneeled on another 24-year-old's neck, killed this guy for standing outside and muttering to himself. It's not over. This isn't even the start. One down, 1,000, 10,000 to go.
Like, I feel like he's going to be scapegoated, Derek Chauvin, for like this entire movement for police accountability, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, hey, we did it. Like, we got the guy. We don't have to worry about this as much. And
I don't think it's going to happen. I think people are too mad. He will be the scapegoat, but people aren't going to stop coming for them anymore.
I think the cat's out of the bag in that regard, but I just don't know if the response will be as strong as it once was.
I think from neolibs, it will not be. I think plenty of people will keep pushing, but it is really discouraging when people say, oh, justice was done. It's kind of like the system works. We can all go home now. And no, the system doesn't work. The system only convicted a cop in this case because of the immense amount of pressure, all the man hours that we spent in the streets fighting about this.
Mhm.
Like, that is the only reason. With that, he never would have been convicted.
Yeah, there's a literal video of him committing the act, and that's not enough. It takes people literally rioting and shutting down the US for hours at a time.
I think people think of the killings with police brutality kind of as a phenomenon of the mid 2000s, kind of starting with Trayvon Martin to the present. But the proper way to contextualize police killings of Black Americans and other Americans of color is going all the way back hundreds of years. Like, this is the legacy of lynching. It never stopped from the first slave being brought over until the last person just killed today. This is all the same story, and we're not even in a discrete step of it farther along that's more evolved. Like, this is the same thing happening. It takes way more than one trial and one guilty verdict to end something that's so deeply ingrained in our national DNA.
Yeah, and the proper response to this, what I was hoping to see was like actual legislation being championed by the Biden administration, right? Being like, hey, we got him. I don't know, maybe I am almost 100% certain that I just was not listening to the Biden administration's response to this, so that's probably on me. But
I don't think you missed anything.
right, that I'm sure there was like a statement made saying, hey, this is a great step forward, blah blah blah, but all words, I mean no action, right? So I was hoping to see some sort of like federal legislation. My team's name, Pelosi's Pawns, is because recently she referred to George Floyd as a sacrifice. Thank you for sacrificing yourself, George Floyd. How heartbreaking was it, him crying out to his mother? It's just sorry, that really upset me.
It's very blatant marketing of a horrible tragedy and a man's horrible death and his family's suffering for the political gain of the Democratic Party. It's frankly disgusting.
And that's basically what the undertone there is.
So one of the things that Joe Biden did do, which, once again, I don't know where this is going to go, but the Attorney General did open up an investigation into Minnesota's police department. I don't know what that's going to result in, to be perfectly honest. Probably nothing. How did we let Derek Chauvin get prosecuted?
Yeah, how do
we keep this from ever happening again?
But I do think, and Lexi, let me know if you feel like this is true. I feel like to a certain degree that trial did set some sort of legal precedent in terms of like this amount of information structured in this way, presented in this way, ended up resulting in a guilty verdict, right? So I feel like it does provide other, basically like people in court, some sort of basis or just some sort of baseline in terms of like what has been successful in the past in order to like mimic or copy or kind of draw from or build upon.
We riot every single day. There are 3 days in 2021 where a cop hasn't killed a citizen.
Where are those prosecutions? See, honestly, I would say no. I think if our justice system worked the way it's supposed to, based on the setup of our system, not based on like the cultural context, because this system in this context will never work justly. But if it did what it said that it was doing, then yes. But the law is all about finding a way to couch whatever you want the outcome to be in procedure and in precedent. So in this case, first of all, the reason that this verdict won't be super impactful is because it's not a higher court verdict. So if it's a trial level court, that can essentially be ignored by everyone. It is technically precedent for the court in which it was decided, but it's not precedent for anywhere else around the country. So all a judge or a jury wants to do, the judge in criminal cases, the judge is the one making procedural rulings. So what evidence to be allowed in, what counts, things like that. And then the jury actually decides what the facts are. So the judge decides the law, the jury decides the facts. So if a judge wants the outcome to be not this, all they have to do is point to other cases in their jurisdiction or cases in their higher courts that have been appealed or upheld that say the opposite. And there are so many of those because so many cops, due to qualified immunity, get away with literal murder constantly in this country that this isn't a very strong tool, if a tool at all. I actually think the circumstances of this conviction are very specific. And in the future, defense attorneys for killer cops will definitely argue that the factual circumstances in that case are different than the case of their clients, because that's what lawyers do. I mean, you just take the most immoral position that you can because you're getting money for it. And it doesn't matter what the truth is. It doesn't matter at all that justice is done to lawyers. All that matters is that their version of the truth is accepted by the judge and by the jury. And that is the fundamental underlying principle of the legal system, not the finding of truth and the doing of justice. Those two things are completely beside the point.
It's one of those things where like none of this stuff even matters up until we end qualified immunity and actually like demilitarize our police. Like ultimately all of this is like surface dressing for the actual issue that needs to be solved. Has the Biden administration taken any serious action in terms of ending qualified immunity?
No.
I think there were some bills introduced in the House, but they're not making it to this.
They did say that they did not like the slogan "defund the police." So that's been an official stance.
So this isn't something that we've talked about before, but I figured might as well get into it now because it is a really big leftist topic. So I'm actually a prison abolitionist. And what that means essentially is that I think prisons should be either completely abolished or curtailed to the point where they're used in very, very, very rare circumstances. So the reason for that is that like caging people is fundamentally inhumane, and it's also not effective. It doesn't help with recidivism. It doesn't help the families if they're murdered loved ones or if somebody is stolen from. Like, it doesn't help any victims of crime get closure, essentially. It doesn't help rehabilitate people. So for me, victory when it comes to the criminal justice system is a complete overhaul of the structure of our criminal legal system. I don't think that we can have a truly just world if prisons exist. And that is a tough position when it comes to things like killer cops in situations like this, where obviously Derek Chauvin is the worst of the worst. And there needs to be an intervention. But I think that it has to be this like system-wide holistic overhaul where we're not setting up situations where people even have the capacity to kill someone like that and to have that level of authority over George Floyd's person legally. And so I think prison abolition and defunding the police really go hand in hand. They both have to happen simultaneously. And our vision of justice should be more around not punitive responses in the streets and in our prisons, but in viewing the commission of crime as a social problem, a public health problem, and addressing it accordingly, because our society is just armed to the teeth and things only get more violent if you're incarcerated.
Yeah, I feel like current day prisons are basically modern day slavery.
Oh, absolutely.
And you're seeing it with prison labor.
With private prisons, the majority of prisons are literally used as a profit generating entity, not an entity that has anything to do with justice or even some faint fabricated notion of justice. It's all about making money.
And it's definitely just a lazy approach, right? I mean, but to a certain degree, I actually do feel like it is intentional. Like I do feel like it is intentional.
We went straight from literal chattel slavery to sharecropping to the prison industrial complex. And that's been charted by a lot of scholars. If any of our listeners haven't read the book, The New Jim Crow, or watched the documentary, The 13th, those two sources give a really good chronicling of this direct path from chattel slavery to the modern prison industrial complex.
I think it was in the great words of Killer Mike. God, what is the line? Oh man, just listen to Ronald Reagan by Killer Mike.
That's my favorite song. Calling Ronald Reagan the devil. It's just like so cathartic for me.
Slavery was abolished unless you are in prison. You think I'm bullshitting? Then read the 13th Amendment. Involuntary servitude and slavery prohibits. That's why they're giving drug offenders time in double digits.
Killer Mike is truly a gem. He's quite the revelation.
So right before her second term, AOC created a PAC.
But instead of paying into the DCCC, she decided to form her own PAC and not pay into what the Democrats used to help each other fundraise.
And I can't remember if the DCC is like all both Senate and House, or if it's just House. But essentially, there's dues that each, I guess, congressperson pays to their respective party. They use those funds to fundraise for campaigns across the country from that party. AOC historically has been like, y'all fucking didn't support me in any way, actively tried to like harm me. Why on earth would I pay you guys those dues? completely awesome. When that happened, I was like, hell yeah. But basically, for some reason, she feels some sort of obligation now to fundraise for Democrats. And because of, I guess, that sense of obligation, she's created a PAC to which her supporters can donate to, and she will use those funds theoretically to fund and support progressive candidates. Now, for some reason, AOC has become a strategist now and is maneuvering towards supporting candidates who are on the teetering edge for, like the Democrats that are in purple districts or, slightly red districts. And she is giving those funds to not necessarily progressive candidates, in specifically the instances that have been an issue, very much not progressive candidates, but who have, I guess, in her eyes, the most likely chance of winning or at least holding the victory in an area where a Democrat either holds a slim majority or has the ability to flip. I think most of the cases, at least from this recent article, were from Democrats who are already in, who need to hold their place in places that are either purple or slightly red. And essentially her supporters are like, we gave you this money to fund progressives. That is not what you're doing. Why are you using our money for your own purposes? To a certain degree, I think we like shit on Joe Manchin, right? To a certain degree of just being like an awful individual. But to a certain degree, there is this balance between representing your constituency versus having your own opinions in terms of what is right. I think there's a balance there. I personally am someone who's more on the side of represent your fucking constituents. That's your job. So, Joe Manchin's in a conservative state. So it's to a certain degree, he is voicing.
But I would love to see the polling data on the $15 minimum wage in West Virginia. I mean, I'm sure most people in West Virginia say, oh, I'm conservative, but do they actually hold all of those conservative views, or are they with like the 70% of Americans who are in favor of raising the minimum wage, in favor of doing something for climate change, in favor of Medicare for all, actually, when it's divorced from the politicized framing?
Also, AOC's whole message was that progressives can win in red districts, so they can win in purple districts. And that was the idea behind the PAC. But for her to go and to not provide funding to progressive candidates in the primaries in swing states, and instead provide it to the incumbent, who is almost always a typical institutional Democrat, that flies in the face of exactly what she ran on.
Circling back to Joe Manchin, Lexi, you make a great point. I mean, if you actually polled the individuals of West Virginia, I'm sure their views are wildly different than the bullshit that he's doing. But to a certain degree, what AOC is doing right now, I think, is also not representative of her population, which is fairly progressive.
Yeah.
I don't think her constituents want to see her funding establishment candidates. So not only is this flying in the face of what the donors who donated to her PAC want to see, but it's also not really representative of her own constituents. Slightly confusing and very concerning.
It's also politically unjustifiable if you're in a system with a primary, because in a primary, you're going to have a candidate either way. It's different if you have an open system like California's system of electing the governor is everybody's just on the ballot. So you don't have a primary. Same with Georgia with the Senate race with Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock. It's just a bunch of people. So you are actively fighting against people from your own party. But if you have a primary system, you fight the primary battle, and then once that's over, you're going to emerge with a candidate from your party regardless. So
yeah,
yes, when you're giving money to one of those candidates, you're helping one of them build their war chest. But at the same time, it is two discrete races. And if people are giving you money to fund progressive causes, there is no reason in a primary system that you would not fund progressive candidates up against establishment candidates. It's completely unjustifiable from a political science standpoint.
I'd like to drop a little fact check in here very quickly. So a poll from February 2021 by the One Fair Wage Coalition claims that 63% of West Virginians support raising the federal minimum wage.
There you go. I mean, at the end of the day, political ideologies have kind of become like a persona that people assume based on, if you're talking about people who pretend to be hyper woke, like for the clout, or people on the other side of the spectrum, people who are super into Fox News and just parrot everything Fox News says. Those things are not not necessarily at all indicative of what people believe on an interpersonal level. That's why you see polling that's so completely divergent from that postulating, because people actually, when you ask them, do you want your raise, you want a raise to $15 an hour? The vast majority of people are going to say yes. And they're not going to think about it unless they're like very thoroughly brainwashed in terms of, oh, wait, what did Fox News say about me specifically getting it? Because usually it's in terms of those immigrants are going to rip you off, stuff like that. So when people think about like the benefit to themselves, their answers to these questions are usually astoundingly different than when they're fulfilling that political persona.
So another thing that I wanted to add about this whole AOC thing is that a little while ago, I don't know if this was part of the more recent news cycle, is that there were certain donations that she made to certain campaigns where those campaigns straight up rejected her donation.
Yes. Yeah.
They were just like, we don't even want this money. We don't even want to associate with you. Now, how do you even get to that point, right? I mean, just not having communicated with the campaign, being like, hey, like, we're going to support you, to even put yourself in the position where they have to then reject it is wild, first off. And then second off, for a lot of these races that she's funding, I wonder how much she's actually even helping. To be perfectly honest, she actually might be hurting more than she's helping, because if these truly are purple districts, having the AOC tag behind you is probably not going to help your chances of winning.
That's a really good point.
What is she even trying to do here? It probably would be even better for just to stay out of it.
Or donate to the PCCC, which was already going to do what she's trying to do. But I mean, those are exactly the people that rejected those donations, right? Were the people in the purple districts that were like, oh, I can't have AOC, you know.
I mean, I'm sure she made a deal with some people high up in the party. That's the only thing that makes sense.
What if she's like secretly trying to do this to like make the establishment Democrat lose by like fake giving her support to them?
The most likely situation that I can see in my head, because why would she risk her political credibility with people on the left for a backhanded move like that? Like, to me, the most likely situation is she's trying to pave the way for a presidential run, trying to like tighten her ties with or make nice with some people in the establishment so that she's seen as a viable candidate. And like, it makes a little bit of sense, but at the same time, like, who do I want to see in the White House? I want to see somebody who never compromises. Like, I want to see a Bernie who always sticks with it. But is that a viable path after what the DNC did to Bernie both times he ran? I don't know.
I also wonder who's in charge of her PAC, the Courage to Change PAC. Is it really her? Are there people making unilateral decisions without her consent? This story just came out today, so I am interested in hearing a response. Is there anything else Biden has done? He recognized the Armenian genocide, joining the majority of Europe and South America and North America.
Good. That should have happened a long time ago. However, I wish he would just go down the list of things America should have done a long time ago and then do like a batch announcement, you know? It's hard when it's making good about one thing that's like 50 years too late. You know, it's hard to be like, what a champion of justice.
It's also because it's politically expedient, right? Erdogan is falling out of favor in Turkey. So it makes sense for Biden to be like, oh, by the way, we didn't support Turkey all along, even though we're their ally technically.
Going back to the AOC thing real quick, recently she did say that she thinks that Biden has exceeded expectations for progressives in general. Yeah, I don't know amongst y'all if Biden has exceeded our expectations. You know, if the expectation was that he was gonna do jack shit, then sure.
To be fair, my expectation was George Bush. So technically he's exceeded expectations, but he's so far below what's acceptable to me as a leftist that comment really rubbed me the wrong way.
You know, I think what you said with her like gearing up for a presidential run, you know, I guess it could kind of make sense if she's trying to like really strike the moderate stance between the progressive side and like, okay, well, now I need to appeal to mainstream Dems. Like, how would I do that? I don't agree with her strategy if that's what she's actually doing.
It's still gross. It's gross either way. Honestly, I wish that the progressive wing of the party would go full Tea Party. That's a political strategy that's clearly worked.
We've talked about this in the past, right? So, you know, why is it that Joe Manchin holds all the power in the Democratic Party? Why is this like one jackass, hold the key to legislation passed by the Democrats, right? It's very interesting to see that, now that progressives actually have power, they don't actually flex it at all. The whole force the vote thing, the whole, hey, we won't vote for Pelosi if, they don't force the vote for Medicare for all. Et cetera, et cetera. Like all of these things that even CNN and MSNBC are now starting to ask, where they're like, hey, y'all have power. Why aren't you using it?
And why not at least hold the line?
Exactly, right? Like, I don't understand why. I know there's some political reason behind it, why they won't actually flex their power, why they won't actually do these things. Can't put our finger on it until it's like explicitly said, hey, this is why we can't, right? They will never say it. It's very surprising to me that these people who championed themselves and ran on, hey, I will never compromise, I will fight for you like through thick and thin, all of a sudden are like, we can't fight for you just yet, we need to wait when it's politically expedient to do so. And it's like, well, then what the fuck is the point of your power, right? Why did we elect you?
I feel like we've heard almost nothing from the squad since Joe Biden got elected,
except for about student loans. That's the only thing that a handful of them, not even the whole squad, I think Ilhan and Ayanna have been pushing on is $50,000 in student loans. But besides that,
it's just quiet. I'm sure they're doing some stuff in the background, but why were they more vocal during the Trump presidency?
it was very politically expedient. Neoliberals were on the same side as progressives because Trump was so blatantly far right. And so there was no political cost of calling him out. That's why there were so many more people calling out Trump than calling out Bush in the early 2000s, is because it wasn't as politically expedient to do that, even though it was the right thing to do. So now people are getting awfully quiet because there isn't that big boogeyman. It's just the quiet machinations of the system that you have to be calling out, and people aren't willing to do that.
I'm just personally tired of Joe Biden just like dropping these kind of shitty proposals down on Congress versus progressives just being like, okay, we know that this is an issue. Why don't we just put something fuck together, and put this out before? It seems like whatever president is in power, their party, it seems like that party's role in Congress is basically just to pass the president's agenda.
Which is not what the founders envisioned. Just saying.
Yeah.
Co-equal branches of government.
Yeah, what did the founders envision? Expand on that, Lexi.
I could talk about this forever. Basically, the executive not supposed to have nearly as much power as it does. And we've seen a dramatic expansion of the executive, probably from Nixon to the present. George Bush was a really, really big proponent of this, like increasing the power of the executive. And Obama did the same thing. Trump did the same thing. I'm sure Biden will continue the trend. But basically, because of the system of bureaucracy that's set up with all the agencies under the executive basically has all of the, honestly, lawmaking and enforcement power instead of just having the enforcement power. So Congress can do things in broad strokes, but the executive is entirely in charge of administering that agenda and what it actually means in a tangible form. And they're also in charge of administering the military. So even though Congress is supposed to declare war, the president has basically taken over that responsibility and fails to seek congressional approval every single time when there's an armed conflict. So perpetual war has basically led to a situation where Congress has no war-making authority when constitutionally that's one of Congress's primary responsibilities.
So another question that I have for you, Lexi, considering that we have a flawed constitution, how much should we be using the tenets of the Constitution as reasons to uphold it or not uphold it?
Essentially, one of the big bulwarks of conservative legal thought in America is that the Constitution is God and the founders are a lower tier of God. So whatever they said is what America needs, which first of all makes no sense that something innovated in a time of crises, full of compromises, that was fundamentally what nobody wanted 200 years ago would be the predictor of our future possibility is first of all insane. But second of all, even taking them on their own terms, that the Constitution is God, they never actually follow the Constitution. I learned a lot of things in law school that made me not believe in America, but that is one of the main things that I learned that made me not believe in America, because Scalia will talk about originalism and focusing on the Constitution and what the text of the Constitution says all day, but then won't follow it at all. The Second Amendment jurisprudence is a particularly stark example of that, because the Constitution says in its text that it's the right to keep and bear arms in order to have a well-regulated militia. It's very narrow. It says nothing about assault rifles, clearly, but when it's politically convenient, it becomes the right to bear any type of weapon that's ever been invented in any scenario that has nothing to do with a militia. So the reason that I bring up what the Constitution says and what the founders say are for that very reason. That's still a very politically potent argument in America, even and now kind of especially among the Democrats on the bench and the judges who are more in the middle. I wouldn't say any of them are on the left of the justices, but they've all kind of capitulated to the argument the Constitution is God and that we need to follow the text of the Constitution, not the spirit of the law or what's for the good of the people, because the Constitution is this like objective monolith of what America needs and deserves, which again makes absolutely no sense. So taking that argument on its terms, nothing that Republicans or Democrats have done over the past 200 years has been in line with that principle. So the principle is flawed on its face, and it's also flawed in its application. So yeah, we should rewrite the Constitution, is what I think. The Constitution, fundamentally, a constitution and the government that operates off that constitution needs to have the consent of the governed. And that can't even be said about our constitution, because that constitution was not consented to by anyone who wasn't white, which is a huge proportion of the population. And it also wasn't consented to by anyone who is a woman. And also, even better about the Constitution, yeah, it only applied to wealthy white male landowners. So only a tiny fraction of our society was ever asked for their consent to be governed by the Constitution that we have. So that in and of itself, when it comes to political theory, is grounds enough for us to rewrite and update the Constitution. And then getting into the practical applications of it, like, of course it needs to be rewritten. It's tremendously out of date.
We're the only ones who haven't done it, who haven't rewritten their own constitution. Yeah, if this is supposed to be a contract between the government and the people, it's not succeeding.
You have to update your contract.
Yeah, I will say that the status quo makes perfect sense from the perspective of the Constitution and how it was written back then. It did its job, and nobody wants to change that.
Trump is who the founders would have wanted. He's rich. He was rich. He's propertied. He's a white man. I mean, they would have picked Trump over Barack Obama any day of the week.
You're probably right, but I don't know if our viewers want to hear that.
Well, here's the hard truth, viewers. I have a lot more spicy
Trump
takes.
is the quintessential president.
Just because you watched Hamilton doesn't mean you actually know who these people were. I guarantee you they were all pieces of shit.
Yeah.
I don't know about all. Yeah.
I
don't know enough. I don't know enough. Yeah.
They were. They absolutely were.
Anyone who can sign a document that says we are all created equal and has a whole batch of slaves back home has some shitty cognitive dissonance going on there.
Also, what they did with the American Revolution is create a system of government in which the little guy had a lot more power. Under the Articles of Confederation, there were avenues for economic justice for people with lesser means compared to like the wealthy landed elite. They like never had power before. So they were actually seeking economic justice when the founders congregated together, overthrew the government that they just created, and put in place our current Constitution. So our current Constitution is founded on a wealthy ruling elite not giving the little guy anything. And I think our teachings in like elementary school and high school and shit don't get into what actually the practical implications of the Articles of Confederation were and why they were overthrown by this elite group of men. And I think that's intentional.
But yeah, so basically the crux of my question, and once again, we can get this into the next episode, is that when you have a basis like that, and we talk about like, oh yeah, like the executive authority has been expanded, how do we know what is a good path and what is a bad path when we can't even take the Constitution as its original form as even a means of centering, right? So we can say, oh, the Constitution intended for the executive branch to not have this much power, but the Constitution itself is created by wealthy white landowners. So what the fuck do they know? You know,
Well,
so it's
yeah,
like,
I mean, yeah, when you get down to it, it makes absolutely no sense to argue on those terms. I think when you have people who are so committed to arguing on those terms and they can't even concede that they pretend that they concede, but they don't in fact concede the fact that those men set up a government in which three branches of government were co-equal, and the executive isn't supposed to have this overreaching power to basically be kind of like a king, honestly. I mean, there's a lot that the president can't do, but there's a lot that the president can do. And at the end of the day, as we saw like with Trump and Bush, the Constitution is only a document. So if people want to push the limits of that document and the other branches don't have power to push back, then you don't have co-equal branches of government. So you can't say that the system of government that the founders set up is good or working, because it is neither good nor working. The people who say that they're committed to it are the very people who participate in undermining it.
The fact that Biden or Trump or any number of presidents in the past can come up and say, hey, this is the plan that the legislative branch needs to enact is utterly ridiculous. The president should just be there to sign off on the piece of paper once it comes in through the door and nothing else. Like, they cannot be the one drafting legislation or commanding the legislative branch to draft that legislation for him.
which is why I've been surprised that the squad has not pushed back. They've just been like, oh my God, this shit is great. What are you talking about? You've literally already introduced legislation in past sessions that have blown this shit out of the water. Why are you now? It's so confusing to me.
In some of the cases, they've introduced legislation in this session that blows it out of the water, you know?
Yeah.
I think people get very caught up. Like, it's easy to spit revolutionary lines when you're running for office and you know that's what the people want to hear. But people who run for office are typically very egocentric and very ambitious. So it doesn't take that much to sway people like that, you know, because the type of people who are not in it for themselves aren't running to be a congressperson, you know. I think Bernie is a very, very, very rare exception to that rule. And I had hoped most of the squad members were. I think Ayanna Pressley is still working on it, but everybody else is kind of like, but I also wonder like how much of it is the fact that the media has moved on. The media liked the squad when they were opposing Trump, but now Biden is the media's darling. So they're not going to be publishing article after article about the people who oppose Biden ideologically because they don't want those people to have power.
It does make me curious as to why they're pushing them from the left, right? It's like, wait, hey, why aren't you flexing your power, squad? The fact that I'm hearing that from like CNN and MSNBC makes me a little curious.
The group that I'm the most disappointed in are Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Ed Markey. Because that trio in the Senate could actually stall a lot of the shit that's happening and actually push it to the left. And they are not doing that. They're letting Joe Manchin and Sinema be that block. I
am entirely certain the political ramifications from like the blue dog Democrats and like the blue chip and old guard, whatever you want to call it, is just too great for them to actually put their foot in the ground for once.
But Bernie has nothing to lose. Same with Warren. Like, they're old, you know, they've had the seats for a while.
Bernie has everything to lose. Bernie has the entire movement to lose, right?
Like, yeah, I mean, I guess you're right.
That's the entire problem, right? It's like he knows what he has. He's literally been dancing on the line since 2016, right? It's like, how do I keep this going forever? A big part of that is him not putting his foot in the ground, because it's the second he becomes an antagonist to the Democratic Party, the entire left becomes antagonistic to the Democratic Party, because they can just paint everything in that light. So.
We're already treated that way.
Yeah, but less so.
I know I've argued the exact opposite point in like our last episode, but it's just the more time that goes on, the more I'm like, at least take a little bit of at least hold your ground,
yes,
you know,
yeah.
At least be inching forward. You don't have to be like out there demanding a socialist republic tomorrow, but at least be like pushing the needle a little bit.
I would hope he would have pressured the squad to do so, right? Like Bernie couldn't do it, but be like, hey, look, y'all can, and y'all are like young enough in the career to where like you won't lose your constituency. You may lose some of the moderate Dems, but they're already wishy-washy against progressives anyways.
Well, once again, the future is bleak, but we're still out here recording our podcast, hoping for a better tomorrow.